So the title of my research is The Economic Impact of Migration on the Welfare of Ethiopian Households. And this research is basically, what I'm basically trying to do is I'm looking at the impact migration has on the consumption expenditure of households. And in order to do that, I need to look and study and analyze the factors that determine the consumption expenditure of households in Ethiopia. And yeah. And I'd like to also add that although this research is purely focused on Ethiopia, I think it reflects to an extent the realities in many developing countries. And I think you can draw from it and draw parallels to Sudan. And based on my own experience of living in Sudan, we do exhibit similar migration patterns in Sudan. So just to give you a quick overview, I'm gonna start off by giving you a bit of background and motivation behind my research. I'm gonna cover the key questions that I aim to answer by the end of this presentation. I'm also gonna cover briefly just the current literature and the evidence that's out there in the field. I'm gonna describe the household survey that I used and the data, just to put it into context. And then I'm gonna describe briefly just the conceptual framework, my methodology. I'm gonna discuss the results, and then I'm gonna present my conclusions. And I'm hoping to spend a bit more time on the policy implications. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background, and before I start, I wanna define what I mean by migration. When I say the word migration, I'm referring to both internal migration, so it's when people move from rural to rural areas or rural to urban areas. And when I refer to international migration, I'm referring to people who move from either rural or urban areas to other countries. And in the case of Ethiopia, a lot of migrants move to Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the USA. Those are the four most popular destinations for Ethiopian migrants. And migration is a very common strategy for moving out of poverty, because it improves the welfare of households. And the way it does that is it increases households' consumption and investment capacities, okay? And the main benefits of migration accrue through the receipt of remittances, okay? And by remittances, in Arabic, التحويلات, is basically the transfer of cash or in-kind goods. So there's two types of remittances. There's cash remittances or goods. And remittances is basically the transfer of this cash or goods back to their origin households, okay? So their families back home. Yeah, and yeah. And basically, I'd also like to add to that, remittances can either be sent through formal or informal channels. So we have formal channels, which are basically money operators such as MoneyGram, UAE Exchange, Western Union, and that sort of thing. But also a lot of remittances go through informal channels and are not recorded. I know as a Sudanese person, when I go back to Sudan, people give me things to carry back home, whether it's cash, whether it's goods. These are things that go unrecorded, but they still count nonetheless as remittances. I'd also like to say that although remittances are always characterized in numbers, it's a very human story. It's very life-changing. If you look at the reasons why people migrate, 90% of the reason as to why people migrate is for economic reasons. They move to better their own lives, their families' lives, to contribute back to their communities and to their countries of origin. So it's basically, there's a huge impact of remittances. The main benefits, though, of remittances is that they're a very reliable source of foreign exchange earnings, especially for international remittances I'm talking about at the moment. They're also very large. I'd like to present you with this graph. If you look at remittances, recorded remittances, it's that dark blue line. As you can see, if you compare it to official development assistance, ODA, which is basically foreign aid, it is 3 times the size. So at the moment, remittances are over 400 billion, whereas foreign aid is around 150 billion. So we're talking about 3 times as much remittances. So they're very large, okay? They're also growing. So as you can see in the graph, it's constantly rising. They're also a very stable source of capital flows. So relative to, if you see basically foreign direct investment, which is that light purple line, if you look at 2007 during the global recession, remittances didn't react. So they're very resilient to global recessions. They don't respond to fluctuations in interest rates in developed economies, as we see with other external capital flows, such as foreign aid and foreign direct investment. However, the only problem, or I guess downside, is that remittances can make households overly dependent. Households rely on remittances, basically. It makes us more complacent. Okay, so the key research questions I'm gonna hope to answer is, would households with migrants have been better or worse off had the migrants stayed at home? This is the question I'm gonna answer today. And the way I'm gonna do that is, and in order to do that, I also need to determine, well, which households are winners and losers and why. And these are very interesting questions to pose because job opportunities have opened up for many Ethiopians. They're currently undergoing a booming economy, especially in the construction sector. So it's very important to understand, well, which type of households are more likely to gain or lose? Should members of the household decide to migrate, or are they better off just staying at home? What's the best solution? What's the best outcome? And also, international remittances to Ethiopia have increased by 10-folds. They've gone up from 53 million US dollars in 2000 up to 624 million US dollars in 2012. That's a massive increase. So it's important to be able to study the economic impact of those transfers. The current literature, I'm just going to briefly go through this. The way I view it is there's optimists, so those are people who view migration in an extremely positive light. They see that migration, especially international migration, allows the flow of remittances, experience, skills. It basically allows the influx of all these things, and this basically brings back positive returns to the economy. Okay. So this is basically a very optimistic view because it assumes a very vital agent, which is that migrants are going to return back to their country, and that's not always necessarily the case. Whereas the pessimists view migration in a negative light, so they think that the sum of remittances sent back home are too small to make any substantial impact on the national economy. Another thing that the pessimists or historical structural dependency views and theories think is that it's not the poorest in society that choose to migrate, it's actually the richer households. And as a result, if you have the richer or the wealthier people migrating abroad, then that's going to widen the inequality between the rich and the poor in society. And the other, I guess another factor is that pessimists view migration as, they view it as, they think that it results in the brain drain. I'm sure you guys have heard of that term, which is basically the loss of the relatively educated people in society who are able to seek better opportunities abroad. I'm more of a believer in the new economics of labor migration, which basically views remittances as the main motive for migration, and also sees remittances as a form of income insurance. So people decide to migrate to protect themselves against any income shocks. Which makes sense. So it's basically they view remittances and migration as a decision to diversify your earnings, your income earnings. So just to give you an idea, so the data I've utilized was very recently collected data. It was collected in 2014. So the evidence I'm going to present you with at the moment is very new evidence. It hasn't been published before, but I'm working on getting it published this summer. It was collected by the Migrating Out of Poverty research program, which is funded by DFID. It uses cross-sectional household data. It covers 7,876 individuals all around Ethiopia. 7,876 individuals from 1,200 households from 4 specific regions in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is basically, it's divided into 9 administrative regions. So the data I'm using is from Tigray, Amhara, SNNP, and Oromia. So these 4 regions. And I'm just going to present you with a bit of descriptive stats to give you an idea of what the data looks like. 77% of the households that were surveyed had a migrant, and 56% of those households had more than 1 migrant. So this is just to give you an idea of the scale of migration in those households. And just to give you an idea as well, of those households with international migrants, you can see here, 26% of households with international migrants, 26% of them migrated to the Middle East, which is a very popular destination for Ethiopian migrants, as I mentioned previously, whereas the rest all migrated internally. So actually, internal migration is higher than international migration. And I think that's something the media tends to perceive us into thinking it's the other way around, but actually we see a lot more internal migration than we do international migration. Also, the way I've classified this data is I've classified it into households with migrants and households without migrants. And when I've done that, you can see here that households without migrants have higher consumption, total monthly consumption expenditure, or per capita consumption expenditure. So basically, households without migrants appear as better off. And as you can see, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So what I've done is I've had to compare households with and without migrants. But obviously, some households might positively select. So you might experience the fact that it's the richer households that choose to migrate. So you can't compare richer households with poor households. So what I had to do is I implemented what's known as a Headman model. I won't go into too much detail, but I basically modeled the consumption of households with no migrants. And I've regressed this model of consumption expenditure versus all these independent variables that determine consumption. So let's say, what determines your household consumption? Obviously, the size of your household. The number of elderly and children relative to the size of the household, so your dependency ratio. The maximum education of members in that household. Also, household dwelling characteristics. All of these factors determine your consumption. And after I've done that, and I estimated this model for households with no migrants, okay? No migrants. And after that, I used the coefficient estimates to predict what the consumption might have been for households with migrants had the migrants stayed at home. And when I did that, that gave me an estimate of their counterfactual consumption expenditure. And I was able to compare that counterfactual with their actual consumption expenditure to find out, well, were they better off or worse off with migration? And once you regress the difference, you can see that actually, if you have a higher gender ratio or higher remittances, then that would decrease your probability of being made worse off. So those were the two main factors. So to give you a summary of my findings, as you can see here, so had the migrant not migrated, the household consumption expenditure would have been lower than their actual. So actually, on average, households are being made better off from migration. But if you look at it based on percentiles, you'll see that the opposite applies for the lower income households. So households in the lower percentiles are actually made worse off by migration. And this is illustrated here. You can see here that lower income households, had households with migrants not migrated, they would have experienced 31% lower consumption expenditure, as illustrated in this graph. And you can see here that obviously it's the lower income households, this is in logs, are made worse off. So in conclusion, just because of time constraints, I'm not going to repeat my conclusion. I'm going to move on to my policy implications. So as you can see, on average, households are being made better off from migration. So I think policymakers need to reduce restrictions on migration. They need to put in more effort to facilitate the migration process. And the reason I say that is as well because we can see that poor households are being made worse off. And the reason they're being made worse off is because the cost of the transfer of remittances is high. The cost of migration is a very costly process. A lot of people go into debt to fund the cost of migration. They take loans from their families, their friends. It's a very costly process. Also, they're not exposed to good opportunities when they go abroad. So all these reasons explain why poor households are actually made worse off. So the government or policymakers should facilitate the transfer of money, because at the moment, all over Africa, the average of the transfer of remittances, the average cost is 12%. That's a substantial cost. So if you were to transfer $100 US, it would cost you $12 to transfer that amount of money. And that's pretty ridiculous, I think, in our time of age, where transfer of money shouldn't be that expensive. Also, policymakers should enhance the competition in remittance markets, obviously to reduce the cost of remittance transfers. Also, make the option of staying at home more attractive, especially for the poor households, because as we've seen, they're being made worse off. So policymakers should put in more effort towards investing in agricultural inputs, offering them better employment opportunities, and also pursuing urban development. And the reason I say that is because if you live in a rural area and you migrate to an urban area because there's better opportunities, this is going to create scarcity of labor in that rural area, and it's going to increase the marginal productivity. And as a result, the wages are going to go up in that rural area. So as you can see here, there's a lot of advantages to urban development as well. Also improving the infrastructure, basically creating good job opportunities for people, to just make it more attractive for them to stay at home. Also offering them, so 48% of my sampled migrants were females who moved to GCC countries. And according to the International Labour Office of Ethiopia in 2005, a lot of the female migrants were actually being paid less than others. So other, like, let's say, Filipino migrants from the Philippines, let's say. So as you can see, Ethiopian migrants are being, they're not treated as equally. So the policymakers should invest in pre-departure training on household management, should offer them training to improve their negotiation skills. And all of that is to basically improve their opportunities once they go abroad and improve their earnings capacity to ensure that they do better once they leave the country. And I'd also like to add that also by regulating the migration, by introducing employment standards, a lot of migrants tend to be exploited once they're abroad. We see a lot of human trafficking, as you mentioned. We see a lot of smuggling. And Ethiopian policymakers should be investing in the introduction of quite stringent, like, employment standards to ensure that is not the case. Because it's normally the poorer households and poorer migrants that are exposed to those types of abuses. And finally, I'd like to end my presentation on this quote. It says that migration has been politicized before it has been analyzed. I think that's very true. I think migration is, it has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with people's livelihood and people's right to live a dignified life. And I think nowadays we live in an era where we speak about migration, we speak about refugees in the form of numbers, and we almost forget that these are humans, these are lives that we're talking about. And I think we need to invest a lot more on research into migration. Like, as I mentioned earlier, remittances are 3 times the size of foreign aid, yet we can sit here all day and in class and in academia endlessly debating foreign aid and the pros and the cons, but we constantly neglect remittances. And if there's one takeaway message from today, I want you to start realizing the importance of the phenomena of remittances and start to maybe think a bit more and try harder to study the impacts of these remittances, to facilitate them and to ensure that they're being invested in the right way. But thank you.